So today I want to talk about the first chapter of this book that we are reading in the New Testament class, The Meaning of Jesus' Two Visions. Um, Whenever you read nonfiction, you have to ask yourself three questions. The first question is, what is the essential question? In other words, what is the question that the author is trying to address or is addressing? The second question you need to ask is, well, what is their thesis? What is their argument? What are they actually, how are they answering the essential question? And then number three, the third question you want to ask is, well, how do they argue it? What is their method? A couple of things. The essential question is generally straightforward. The thesis is not generally at the bottom of the final sentence of the introduction. The thesis in a lot of more academic nonfiction is a little bit more nuanced, and so you have to read very carefully. And then the method is essentially, how is the author making the argument? We really need to understand, how do they make this argument as we go along? So let's dive into chapter 1. The essential question you can oftentimes see is even on the page right before the chapter, which is what both of the scholars in chapter 1 and chapter 2 are going to be addressing, is how do we know about Jesus? In other words, and he summarizes it right here in this first sentence, how do we know about Jesus? What are our sources? What are they like, and how do we use them? He begins by saying that for the majority of Christian history, the answers to these questions he says are fairly obvious. The sources, the New Testament as a whole, the four Gospels in particular. What are they like? Well, the Gospels are simply history reporting what Jesus did. And then he goes on to say, but over the last 200 years, among historical scholars, both within the church and outside the church, this common idea that the Gospels are simply history trying to record what happened has dissolved. In other words, Marcus Borg is really trying to, let me get rid of this guy. Marcus Borg is really trying to address the question here. Are the Gospels really a product of what Jesus said, or are they a product of something that he's going to call the developing tradition? Now, when you read on in this first little introduction here, don't be offended what Marcus Borg is saying here, because he's saying essentially, let's get rid of this one too. Sorry about that. What he's saying here is his wife is an Episcopal priest, and when he was alive, he would travel with her to the Holy Land, and he would be kind of the scholar in residence, and he would kind of direct these trips with his wife, and he would find himself saying oftentimes, well, maybe what the New Testament says didn't happen here, or maybe it didn't happen at all. So he uses the story of the wedding at Cana, which is the opening chapters of the Gospel of John, if you want to read that. And his essential argument is some of the stories that we have in the New Testament are not factual. They probably, notice how he doesn't say they are not, he says they are probably not historically factual. However, don't turn off the webcast. He still goes on to say, but they are profoundly true. Okay, you need to understand that they might not all be fact, but they, for Marcus Borg, are profoundly true. So how does he make this argument? And again, he hasn't given you his thesis yet. Well, he's about to. But how does he make this argument? So the essential question: how do we know about Jesus? His thesis is going to come up pretty quickly. Primarily, we know about Jesus through the Gospels. He's going to unpack what he means by this, how he really tries to understand what the Gospels are and what they entail. Notice what I have underlined here. The two statements about the nature of the Gospels are crucial for understanding the historical task. Number one, they are a developing tradition, and number two, they are a mixture of history remembered and history metaphorized. As a good reader, you're going to now ask yourself, what does he mean by developing tradition, and what does he mean by history remembered and history metaphorized? So what he means by the developing tradition, let me read this. He says, as developing traditions, the Gospels contain two types of material. Some that go back to Jesus and some that go back to the early Christian communities. In other words, the Gospels we know were written sometime, and he says it right here, between the years 70 and 100. Some scholars put it at 65 and 90 of the Common Era. Now, if you think of when Jesus died in the year 30 of the Common Era, that's 35 to 40 to 60 years after his death. And if that's the case, are the Gospels, Marcus Borg is trying to ask, simply reporting what Jesus did? So he says they contain two types of material, some that go back to Jesus and some that are the product of the early Christian community. Now, when he goes on, he talks about the difference between history remembered and history metaphorized. So first, the developing tradition. The developing tradition is simply the tradition that developed after Jesus' death. Okay, and that is what you and I know as Christianity. So he says the Gospels contain history remembered and history metaphorized. History remembered is pretty simple. By the former, again, history remembered, I mean simply that some of the things reported in the Gospels really happened. Jesus really did do and really did say some of the deeds and teachings reported about him. That's what he means by history remembered. History remembered is simply what Jesus did and said. And some of the Gospels contain some of what Jesus really did say and really did do. Marcus Borg really believes that Jesus did, when he marched into Jerusalem in the last week of his life, go into the temple and overthrow the money changers' tables. He really did do that. For Marcus Borg, that's history remembered. By history metaphorized, Marcus Borg means the use of metaphorical language and metaphorical narrative to express the meaning of the story of Jesus. He says he defines metaphor broadly to include both symbol and story. And I want to move down here. Metaphorical language for Marcus Borg and for any scholar is necessarily non-literal. However, it is profoundly true. Notice what he says here. It is non-literal. Its central meaning is to see something as something else. You and I use metaphorical language quite often. The Gospel of John reports that Jesus is the light of the world. And so he says here, to say Jesus is the light of the world is not to say that he is literally a light, but it means to see him as the light of the world. Thus, even though metaphorical language is not literally true, or you could say not literally factual, because that's how we talk about that oftentimes here, it can be profoundly true in the non-literal sense. So these two phrases, history remembered, basically what Jesus did, what Jesus said, and the Gospels from Marcus Borg contain a lot of history remembered. These are the events, the sayings that Jesus actually did. And then history metaphorized, Marcus Borg would also say that the Gospels contain a lot of history metaphorized. And history metaphorized are these non-factual, non-literal truths that the Gospels really try to unpack. He comes back to this phrase a lot, so he unpacks this as he goes along. But I need you to be very familiar with history remembered and history metaphorized. He goes on to tell this, you'll need to read that for sure. But he says, in short, the Gospels do not simply report the history of Jesus. They metaphorize it. In other words, he's trying to argue here that the Gospels don't just say, Jesus did this, did this, did this, did this, did this, did this, did this. He died, he resurrected, and that's it. For Marcus Borg, the Gospels do that, yes, but they do more than that. They really unpack and they really entail the depth of the meaning, the significance of Jesus' life. Because remember, Marcus Borg is one who calls Jesus the Christ, and therefore, for Marcus Borg, the Gospels contain depth and truth. It's not simply what Jesus did and what Jesus said. So he goes on to make a crucial distinction. For Marcus Borg, and again, we can line these up. So here, I'm going to try to do this. On the left side of the page, if you want to think of like history remembered over here, and if you want to think of like history metaphorized over here, what he's going to go on to say is he's going to talk about a pre-Easter and a post-Easter Jesus. Now, pre-Easter will be over on the history metaphorized side, And the post-Easter Jesus is going to be over here on the history remembered side. So now what does he mean by this? So the name of Jesus, he says, has two references. On the one hand, Jesus refers to a human figure of the past. We historical scholars call this the Jesus of Nazareth. He was a Galilean Jew who lived in the first century. So we know that Jesus was alive. He lived, he died, he was Jewish, he lived in Galilee, he was killed by the Romans. We know that. And this is what Marcus Borg calls the Jesus of history. In other words, the pre-Easter Jesus. This is the Jesus of history. This is the historical Jesus. Now, oftentimes, the term Christ was not Jesus' last name. Christ is a theological title. Christos is what the word is in Greek, and it means Lord. In other words, to say that Jesus is the Christ is to say that Jesus is Lord. And notice, not every person calls Jesus the Christ. Christians, yes, they do. Muslims call Jesus a great prophet, but they don't call him the Christ. And so whenever he talks about the post-Easter Jesus, the Jesus of the church, the Jesus of the Christian community, the Jesus of the developing tradition, he uses the phrase the post-Easter Jesus. Again, he comes back and unpacks this much later on. So by the pre-Easter Jesus, I mean, of course, the Jesus during his historical lifetime, a Galilean Jewish peasant of the first century, flesh and blood figure of the past. He says this Jesus is dead and gone, a claim that does not deny Easter. He is going to unpack that later on. By post-Easter Jesus, he says, I mean what Jesus became after his death. More fully, I mean the Jesus of the Christian tradition and experience. Now, he means this in two ways. The post-Easter Jesus is what Jesus became in the tradition, in the gospel tradition. But it's also the post-Easter Jesus, the Jesus of today, who millions, if not billions of people around the world today experience. Experience is going to be such a central part to Marcus Borg's understanding. So now we're starting to unpack a little bit of what his thesis is. In other words, we know about Jesus. Our sources for Jesus are the Gospels. And the Gospels contain both history remembered and history metaphorized, and they are a product of the developing tradition. Now, he goes on to talk about some of his experience growing up. I really want you to read this and understand what he's saying here, because he's trying to argue that in his childhood, in his upbringing, he didn't really think of the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. He thought of what he calls right here the composite Jesus, where the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith were necessarily combined. They were unified. Now, he wants to make a little bit of a distinction, because what he says is when we emphasize the divinity of Jesus at the expense of his humanity, we lose track of the remarkable human being that he was. Now, yes, does he end up combining the history or the pre-Easter and the post-Easter Jesus in the larger picture of his work? Absolutely. But he wants us as good thinkers to think of the Jesus as history, and also to think of the Jesus of faith, and to understand them a little bit separately before we go into deeper analysis of who Jesus was. Okay, so let's start thinking again. Our essential question, how do we know about Jesus? The thesis that he's starting to make is that we know about Jesus through history remembered and history metaphorized. In other words, we know about Jesus through the Gospels, which were produced by what he calls the developing tradition, and they include both history remembered and history metaphorized. Remember, the pre-Easter Jesus was the Jesus of history remembered, and the post-Easter Jesus was the Jesus of, the pre-Easter Jesus was of history history remembered. Yeah, I was right. And then the post-Easter Jesus is the Jesus of history metaphorized. So not only are the Gospels our main source of knowledge, but we have to now start thinking about lenses. What are the lenses that we put on? What are the glasses that we put on in order to understand Jesus? Now, the first lens that we look through to see, to know, to understand Jesus are the Gospels, which he says right here are a product of the developing tradition, and they contain both history remembered and history metaphorized. The second lens that we need to put on our eyes to understand Jesus is a study of ancient Judaism. Okay, Jesus was Jewish. He was thoroughly Jewish. He was not born in the year 1990. He is not a modern person by any means. He was Jewish. We need to understand what ancient Judaism looked like. What was the Judaism of about 2,000 years ago? Now, the third lens that Marcus Borg wants us to use is a study of Jesus and Christian origins. In other words, especially the social world of Jesus. Why did Christianity arise in the first place? What was that early Christian community like? What were the questions? What were the struggles that these early Christians were facing when they were compiling and writing the Gospels? And that's going to be such a key question. Whenever you talk about your own life, if you were describing it to somebody else, you would necessarily talk about your environment, the social world that you lived in. And so too for Marcus Borg, we really need to understand the interdisciplinary study of Jesus and of Christian origins. In other words, what was the social world that Jesus lived in? And then the final lens Marcus Borg wants us to look through in order to understand Jesus, he says, is the cross-cultural study of religion. Just because I am an educated white American does not mean that I have the clearest, the best picture of Jesus. I need to go study about not only Jesus, but other religious figures in other parts of the world. So when I've spent time in Uganda, in Africa, or in Guatemala, or Costa Rica, or even the United States, or Europe, when I have learned and studied there, I realized the point that he's making here. People have different religious experiences, different understandings of Jesus across the world. We need to take that into consideration. Church in Africa was so fun. It was very thoughtful. It was very interactive. Church in Guatemala was equally engaging. It made me uncomfortable because there was a lot of dancing, and I'm just awkward when I dance. But different people around the world have different religious experiences. We understand Jesus differently. And so he also wants us to take very seriously the cross-cultural study of religion. The importance of worldview is very, very important. And we need to talk about this for a second. Now, Marcus Borg, much like N.T. Wright will in chapter 2, laments what happened during the Enlightenment. Because during the Enlightenment, he says here during the 17th and 18th century, the birth of modern science, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, just following the Renaissance, such a fascinating time in history. But what happened during the Enlightenment, according to Marcus Borg, is worldviews began to shift. And there were basically two main categories. There was the religious worldview, and there was the secular worldview. Now, what he goes on to say is that modernity is defined by the secular worldview. So what does he mean by the secular worldview? Well, you need to go back and understand. The secular worldview believes that there is only this. And by this, he means the visible world of our ordinary experience. In other words, the secular worldview is different from the religious worldview because the religious worldview deals with this and more than this. The more than this he talks about has been variously named or conceptualized, but he talks about the more than this as the sacred. In other words, you and I would use the term God. The religious worldview has a sense of reality that is grounded in God, that is grounded in the sacred. And what he goes on to lament that during the Enlightenment that shifted. And so now today, most people, maybe even you, have more of a secular worldview than a religious worldview, or than a religious worldview. So think for a second, what type of worldview did Jesus have? Well, Jesus, for Marcus Borg, had a thoroughly religious worldview. He unpacks that in his next chapter. So you need to understand what he's saying here, that throughout so much of his life, it was dominated by perhaps the secular worldview because the religious worldview caused him problems. But he says, by my late teens and 20s, the problems had become acute. Indeed, the modern worldview has essentially crowded out the religious worldview. But look at what he says. And notice, this is a transition I went through in my academic education as well. He says, but now I see things differently. In my 30s, I became aware of how uncritically, unconsciously, and completely I had accepted the modern worldview. I saw that most cultures throughout human history have seen things differently. I realized that there are authenticated experiences that radically transcend what the modern worldview can accommodate. Man, when I've traveled the world, when I have been here in the States, and even myself, I've seen people who have had religious experience of Jesus. I've seen other people. I struggle to understand and to give language to it, but I think that I've had it myself. And so, therefore, Marcus Borg is talking about a shift in his own life, in his own academic work, that he no longer has merely a secular worldview, but he has a deeply religious worldview. The change of my worldviews has made it possible for me, once again, to take God seriously. Please remember that Marcus Borg, it just passed away earlier in 2015, identified himself as a Christian. He says, I am convinced that the sacred is real. Okay, so let's go back. What is the essential question? How do we know Jesus? Well, what is his thesis? We know about Jesus through the developing tradition, which gave us the Gospels, which include both history remembered and history metaphrized. And so, therefore, let's look really quickly at the Gospels. We know, or at the New Testament, we know that Paul was the earliest. We've talked about this in class already, probably around the year 50. We also believe that the Q document, remember, Q is the similarities between Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. This is probably one of the earlier layers of the gospel tradition. He goes on to say Mark, we know, is the earliest, or we think, this is one of the leading hypotheses. We think that Mark was the earliest existing gospel, sometime around the year 70. Some scholars put it a little bit before 70. I mean, why was 70 important? Just a side note. 70 was when the Jewish temple was destroyed again, causing a major shift, not only in Judaism, but also in Christianity. So this provides the framework. Remember, Matthew and Luke, these two gospels, they used Mark as a source. So Matthew and Luke, he says, each had a copy of the Gospel of Mark. They also had a copy of Q. Again, we've talked about this in class. John, being very, very different from the synoptic gospels, is not a primary source for the historical Jesus. Now, why does he say that? He says that because the Gospel of John, for Marcus Borg, has a lot of history metaphorized. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So you'll want to be familiar with what he's talking about here. And then just a brief note here, and then we will wrap up. We also not only have to understand the Gospels, but we also have to understand the historical context. We have to try as best we can to understand the historical context of Jesus' life. What was the Jewish world? What was Jewish literature? What was the Jewish expectation? We need to, in our analysis of Jesus, really try to understand what was the world like that Jesus was living in? What was the Roman influence on Judaism? And what was the Jewish world, particularly with the Jewish leadership, what he is going to unpack a lot later on. He says, because much of this chapter is focused on how to get beneath the surface of the Gospels in order to discern the historical Jesus, I want to emphasize, as I conclude, that both the historical Jesus and the canonical Gospels matter to me as a Christian. The term canonical Gospels are the four Gospels that we have in the Christian canon: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Again, he wants to have a synthesis, okay, bringing together the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. He wants us to understand, on the one hand, the Jesus of history, and then understand, on the other hand, the Jesus of faith, and then bring these two into a very interesting conclusion or a very interesting synthesis. So let's go back through this one really, really quickly. What is the essential question? The essential question, how do we know Jesus? What's his thesis? We know about Jesus through the developing tradition, through the Gospels. Maybe let me rephrase that. We know about Jesus through the Gospels, which are a product of the developing tradition, and they include both history remembered and history metaphorized. Again, this is how he's making his argument. Well, what is history remembered? History remembered includes the things that Jesus actually did and said. What is history metaphorized? History metaphorized are the non-literal truths that the Gospels are trying to portray. We unpack this one a little bit later on. The example he uses here, when the Gospels refer to Jesus as the light of the world, it's not literally that Jesus is light, but it is very metaphorically true that Jesus is the light of the world. He goes on to talk about a distinction between the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. Remember, the Jesus of history is the pre-Easter Jesus. This is who Jesus was before his death. The post-Easter Jesus is what Jesus became after his death. More fully, he means the Jesus of the Christian tradition. Again, this is all how he's making his argument. Goes on to argue, this is his method, or including his method, that we need to use four lenses for seeing Jesus. We need to really be critical of our own worldview, and we need to try as best we can to get into the worldview of the ancient Jews, of Jesus himself. So he goes on to talk about the gospel tradition, the New Testament tradition. So remember, we've talked about this. This again is all a part of his method. And then he concludes down here with what we see is to a large extent the product of how we see. Thus, our understanding of the sources as well as the lenses through which we see both them and the world of Jesus will decisively affect what we see in the figure behind the Gospels. What all of this means will, I trust, become as clear as the rest of the book. So I hope that helped you unpack some of the core arguments of the first chapter that Marcus Borg is arguing here. Again, trying to answer the question, what are our sources? How do we know about Jesus? And then his thesis, we know about Jesus through the Gospels, which are a product of history remembered and history metaphorized, but we also know about Jesus through history, through trying to unpack who Jesus was as a historical figure. I hope that helped out. And if you have any questions, just hit me up with an email.